"You wouldn't understand, it's complicated," she said when I asked about the midnight phone calls. I should have realized then that when someone says your 8-month relationship is too complicated to explain, they're usually hiding something simple and ugly. I'm Carter, 29, and I work as a renewable energy technician here in Burlington, Vermont, installing solar panels and maintaining wind turbine systems across the Green Mountains. My days involve climbing transmission towers, calibrating inverters, and troubleshooting electrical systems that convert sunlight into clean electricity for homes and businesses throughout the region. My girlfriend Autumn was a freelance event coordinator who specialized in corporate retreats and wedding planning, the kind of work that theoretically required flexible hours but rarely involved emergency calls at 11 p.m. on Tuesday nights. She had this talent for transforming ordinary spaces into magical experiences, whether arranging fairy lights around a barn for a rustic wedding or coordinating ice sculptures for corporate galas at the Shelburne Museum. We'd been sharing a small 2-bedroom apartment near the University of Vermont campus since spring, splitting utilities and groceries while building what I thought was a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals for the future. Until recently, everything felt solid between us. Comfortable in the way that good relationships should feel after the initial excitement settles into something deeper and more sustainable. I loved how she'd get excited planning surprise birthday parties for friends, spending hours researching their interests to create personalized touches that made people feel truly celebrated. I loved how she'd research obscure local farms to source seasonal flowers for events, driving hours to find the perfect peonies or heirloom roses that would make a bride's vision come to life. I especially loved how she'd curl up next to me on our secondhand couch while I reviewed technical manuals for new solar installation techniques, asking thoughtful questions about renewable energy systems and making me feel like my work actually mattered to someone beyond my engineering colleagues. She used to joke that we were both in the business of creating sustainable futures, hers through memorable experiences and mine through sustainable technology, and that parallel made our relationship feel purposeful and aligned. But sometime around our 6-month mark, Autumn's phone started controlling her attention in ways that made me feel like a stranger in our own living room. The device became an extension of her hand, constantly buzzing with notifications that would make her face light up with an excitement she never showed when I walked through the door after work. The calls always came late, usually between 11 and midnight, and she'd answer with this hushed urgency that suggested crisis management for Fortune 500 companies rather than discussing table linens with venue coordinators or finalizing catering arrangements with local restaurants. I'd watch her grab the phone and disappear into our tiny bathroom, the only space in our apartment that offered privacy, where I could hear her voice drop to whispers punctuated by long silences, as if she was listening to complex instructions or emotional confessions that required her complete attention and careful responses. When she emerged 20 or 30 minutes later, she'd be distracted and distant, claiming work stress while scrolling through messages on apps I'd never seen before, apps that didn't look like standard business communication platforms or the usual event planning software she'd shown me in the past. The frequency increased from once a week to nearly every other night. And when I mentioned that event planning seemed to involve an unusual amount of crisis management for someone whose clients were mostly engaged couples and small businesses planning retreats, Autumn would clutch her phone protectively and deliver variations of the same response about things being complicated beyond my understanding, as if my engineering degree and analytical mindset somehow disqualified me from comprehending the intricacies of coordinating centerpieces and catering schedules. I started noticing she'd delete her call history immediately after these conversations, something I discovered when she asked to use my phone charger and left her screen unlocked on the kitchen counter while she went to grab coffee from our French press. Her recent calls showed only mundane numbers from vendors and venues, the kind of business contacts you'd expect from someone planning events, but I knew I'd heard her phone ring dozens of times in recent weeks with that distinctive tone she'd assigned to important contacts. The emotional distance grew alongside the secretive phone behavior, creating a parallel between her digital privacy and her increasing emotional unavailability in our shared physical space. Autumn began working late more frequently, claiming last-minute client emergencies that required her immediate attention at venues across Vermont and even into Montreal, leaving me to eat dinner alone and wonder why someone who used to prioritize our evening walks around the neighborhood was suddenly too busy for basic relationship maintenance. She'd return home around 10 or 11 p.m., exhausted and irritable, deflecting my questions about her day while immediately checking messages on that mysterious app one couldn't identify, her fingers moving across the screen with practiced familiarity that suggested regular use rather than occasional business communication. Our conversations became superficial, limited to logistics about bills and schedules, while she seemed to reserve her emotional energy for whoever was on the other end of those late-night calls that had become as regular as her morning coffee routine. I found myself lying awake listening to her whispered conversations through the bathroom door, wondering when the woman who used to share every detail of her workday, from difficult clients to funny venue mishaps, had become someone who treated basic questions about her schedule like invasions of privacy that required defensive responses and deflection. The apartment that once felt like our shared sanctuary, filled with laughter and plans for weekend hiking trips in the Green Mountains, began to feel like a place where I was merely tolerated while Autumn conducted her real life through a device she guarded more carefully than our relationship itself, checking it constantly and keeping it face down during the rare moments when we still attempted conversations about our future together. I simplified the complicated part. I wrote on the note I left on our kitchen counter next to her keys. The weekend she visited her sister in Montreal gave me exactly the clarity and time I needed to solve the mystery that had been eating away at our relationship for months. Autumn had mentioned the trip casually on Thursday evening while organizing her event planning portfolio, claiming her sister needed help coordinating a surprise anniversary party for their parents, and she'd be gone from Friday afternoon until Sunday night, giving me the first extended alone time in our apartment since the secretive phone behavior had started consuming her attention and emotional availability. I initially planned to use the weekend for catching up on professional development courses related to emerging solar technology and maybe hiking Mount Mansfield if the weather cooperated. But Friday evening brought an accidental discovery that changed everything when I was reorganizing our bedroom dresser to make room for winter clothes storage and found a phone charger cord that didn't match either of our devices hidden behind the furniture where dust had accumulated. The charger was for an older model smartphone, the kind someone might use as a secondary device for purposes they wanted to keep separate from their primary phone, and when I checked our shared Verizon account online using my credentials as the primary account holder, I discovered a second phone number that had been added to our plan 3 months earlier with detailed charges for hundreds of text messages and dozens of long-distance calls to Seattle area codes that occurred precisely during the time frame when Autumn's behavior had become secretive and emotionally distant. The pattern became sickeningly clear as I traced the timeline back to when Autumn's behavior had shifted from open communication to defensive deflection, when she'd started claiming work complications that were apparently just elaborate cover stories for maintaining regular contact with Trevor, her ex-boyfriend who had moved to Seattle 6 months ago for a tech startup position that she'd mentioned exactly once before claiming they'd lost touch completely. I spent Friday night sitting on our couch processing the betrayal, not experiencing the dramatic emotional devastation I might have expected from discovering systematic deception, but rather feeling a calm analytical understanding that the woman I'd been sharing a life with had been systematically lying to me while conducting what appeared to be an emotional long-distance relationship with someone from her past, using my trust and our shared living space as cover for infidelity that had progressed to the point where she needed separate phone lines and secret applications to maintain the deception. Saturday morning, I made the most practical decision of my adult life and began methodically planning my exit from a situation that had already ended. I just hadn't received the official notification yet. My company had been trying to fill a senior technician position at our Albuquerque office for months, working with utility companies to expand solar installations across New Mexico's high desert regions where sunshine was abundant and renewable energy adoption was accelerating rapidly. And when I called my supervisor's emergency line claiming family circumstances required immediate relocation, he approved my transfer request within hours and even arranged for the company to cover moving expenses given the urgency of filling the Southwest position. I spent Saturday afternoon systematically packing my belongings into storage containers I bought from U-Haul, taking only what was definitively mine and leaving behind anything we'd purchased together, from the coffee table we'd assembled during a rainy April weekend to the expensive hiking boots she'd bought me for my birthday. I contacted our landlord to remove my name from the lease, arranged for mail forwarding to my parents' address until I could establish permanent housing in New Mexico, and transferred my security deposit to Autumn's name since she'd be responsible for the full rent going forward, a financial reality that would undoubtedly complicate her monthly budget but seemed like an appropriate consequence for someone who'd been planning her exit strategy through another man while expecting me to maintain our shared household expenses. I cleaned the apartment thoroughly, did 3 loads of laundry including her clothes, stocked the refrigerator with groceries that would last through the following week, and completed every household maintenance task I'd been planning to handle, wanting to leave the space in better condition than I'd found it because my personal integrity mattered more than her deception deserved. Sunday afternoon, I loaded my Honda Civic with essential belongings and drove the packed storage containers to a facility near my parents' house in Montpelier, spending the evening with my family explaining that Autumn and I had ended our relationship and I'd be relocating for work, keeping the details minimal because the specifics of her betrayal felt like private pain that didn't need to become family gossip. I returned to the apartment Sunday evening while Autumn was still in Montreal, wrote the note that summarized 8 months of relationship confusion in 6 perfectly chosen words, and left her keys next to it on the counter along with a printed copy of our cellular bill highlighting the second phone number charges and a brief formal explanation that I'd removed my name from the lease effective immediately. When Autumn returned from her sister's house on Sunday night around 9 p.m., she walked into an apartment that looked exactly as she'd left it except for the conspicuous absence of my presence and possessions. Discovering that the complicated situation she'd been managing for months had been simplified by someone who valued honesty enough to walk away from deception rather than waste emotional energy trying to fix what was fundamentally broken through her conscious choice to prioritize another relationship over our shared commitment. 6 months later in Albuquerque, I was finally building the life I should have been living all along when Autumn's digital pursuit began in earnest. I'd settled into a comfortable routine working on massive solar farm installations across New Mexico's high desert, spending my days troubleshooting inverter systems and calibrating panels that would generate clean energy for thousands of homes. Then returning to my small apartment near Old Town where I'd developed a weekend habit of rock climbing at the Sandia Mountains with a group of outdoor enthusiasts I'd met through a local sustainability workshop. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was literally harnessing the power of the sun for a living while simultaneously discovering that my personal life had needed the same kind of systematic overhaul I applied to failing electrical systems, replacing unreliable components with more efficient and dependable alternatives. My new apartment was a 1-bedroom Adobe-style unit with thick walls that kept the interior cool during blazing summer afternoons and a small patio where I could watch spectacular sunsets paint the Sandia Mountains in shades of pink and orange that made Vermont's green hills seem almost monochrome in comparison. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways that made me realize how much of my energy had been drained by constantly managing Autumn's emotional volatility and secretive behavior, leaving little mental space for professional growth or personal interests that didn't revolve around relationship damage control. I'd started dating casually, nothing serious, just coffee meetings and hiking adventures with people who appreciated straightforward communication and didn't require detective work to understand their basic intentions or availability. That's when Autumn began what I can only describe as a systematic campaign to track down my new location and insert herself back into my life through increasingly creative and concerning methods that demonstrated both impressive research skills and a troubling inability to accept that our relationship had ended through her own choices. The first signs appeared on rock climbing forums where I'd been active since moving to New Mexico, posting questions about route recommendations and gear reviews for the unique sandstone formations that characterize southwestern climbing. I noticed new usernames asking oddly specific questions about Vermont transplants in the Albuquerque area, whether anyone knew renewable energy workers who might be interested in networking events, and if there were climbing groups that welcomed people with experience on East Coast granite rather than desert rock. The writing style felt familiar in ways that made me screenshot the posts and compare them to old text messages Autumn had sent, Recognizing her distinctive habit of using dramatic rhetorical questions and phrases like life-changing opportunities and authentic connections that she'd employed during our relationship when trying to convince me to attend social events I wasn't particularly interested in. She'd created multiple fake profiles on Facebook groups dedicated to outdoor recreation in central New Mexico, posting photos of Vermont landscapes with captions about missing the mountains and wondering if any former East Coast residents had found their tribe in the Southwest. When I began casually seeing Sage, a 27-year-old museum curator I'd met at a workshop about renewable energy applications in cultural preservation, Autumn's online surveillance escalated into direct professional interference that crossed every reasonable boundary of post-breakup behavior. Sage worked at the National Hispanic Cultural Center, developing educational programs that highlighted the intersection of traditional environmental practices and modern sustainability technology, and she had this infectious enthusiasm for both art and conservation that made our conversations feel intellectually stimulating rather than emotionally exhausting. We'd been on maybe 4 dates, nothing exclusive or serious, just enjoying each other's company and discovering shared interests in hiking, photography, and the kind of thoughtful discussions about environmental policy that Autumn had always dismissed as boring professional talk. That's when anonymous emails began arriving at the museum's administrative offices, questioning my reliability and history of abandoning commitments without explanation, suggesting that staff should be cautious about personal relationships with contractors who might not maintain professional standards. The emails were signed with generic names and sent from disposable email accounts, but I recognized Autumn's writing immediately because of her tendency to use phrases like concerning patterns of behavior and professional accountability standards that she'd picked up from event planning workshops and used whenever she wanted to sound authoritative about subjects she didn't actually understand. Sage showed me the emails after her director mentioned them during a staff meeting about maintaining appropriate boundaries with outside consultants, and I found myself in the surreal position of having to explain that my ex-girlfriend from Vermont was apparently conducting a harassment campaign against my new dating relationships using skills she'd developed from coordinating corporate events. I immediately contacted a digital privacy expert recommended by my company's IT department, someone who specialized in helping people trace online harassment back to its sources and document evidence for potential legal action. The expert, a former cybersecurity specialist named Maria who now ran an independent consultancy, helped me trace the communications back to internet cafes near Autumn's new apartment address in Burlington, confirming what I already suspected but providing the technical documentation I'd need if this behavior continued to escalate beyond annoying online posts into genuine professional sabotage that could affect my career or personal relationships with people who had no connection to our failed relationship and didn't deserve to become collateral damage in Autumn's apparent inability to process rejection and move forward with her life. 3 months later, Autumn managed to secure a professional contract that gave her legitimate access to my workplace, demonstrating a level of strategic planning that was both impressive and deeply disturbing in its calculated precision. Through connections she'd cultivated in the event planning industry during our relationship, connections I'd helped her make by attending networking events where she'd met vendors and coordinators who worked with various New Mexico businesses, she positioned herself to organize the grand opening celebration for the massive solar farm project I'd been leading for 6 months. The Solana Vista installation was a significant milestone for our company, a 50-megawatt facility that would power 12,000 homes while serving as a demonstration site for emerging photovoltaic technology, and the marketing department had decided to coordinate a public celebration that would showcase renewable energy innovation to local government officials, environmental groups, and potential investors. Autumn's proposal reached our corporate office through a third-party event management firm that specialized in sustainable business celebrations, and she'd specifically requested to coordinate with the technical team for educational components of the event, claiming expertise in translating complex environmental concepts into accessible public presentations that would highlight the human impact of clean energy initiatives. When I saw her name on the contractor list during our weekly team meeting, I felt that familiar analytical calm settle over me, the same emotional detachment I'd experienced when discovering her secret phone communications, recognizing immediately that this wasn't a coincidence but rather a carefully orchestrated attempt to force contact after months of unsuccessful digital stalking. She arrived at the construction site during a routine inspection on a Tuesday morning in late September, emerging from a rental car wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a leather portfolio that screamed expensive event coordinator, feigning complete surprise at seeing me standing near the main transformer station where I was reviewing voltage readings with two other technicians. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, complete with startled recognition and claims that she had no idea I was involved with this particular project despite the project team being publicly listed on our company website and promotional materials that any professional event coordinator would review before proposing services. I immediately escalated the situation to my supervisor and corporate HR, providing comprehensive documentation that included photos from our relationship, screenshots of her digital harassment campaign, copies of the anonymous emails sent to Sage's workplace, and the technical analysis Maria had provided tracing the communications back to Burlington internet cafes. Our HR department, already sensitized to workplace harassment issues, implemented an immediate policy requiring all interactions between Autumn's event planning team and our technical staff to go through a designated third-party coordinator, effectively eliminating any opportunity for direct personal contact while maintaining the professional separation necessary to complete the project without legal complications. Autumn's response to this corporate boundary was to publish a detailed blog post on Medium titled, "Silencing Women's Voices in Renewable Energy: How Corporate Policies Weaponize Professional Boundaries Against Female Entrepreneurs." A 2,000-word manifesto that portrayed herself as a victim of gender discrimination who was being systematically excluded from networking opportunities by men in the environmental sector who felt threatened by competent women challenging traditional power structures. The post gained significant momentum in environmental professional circles, shared extensively on LinkedIn and Twitter by people who had no knowledge of our personal history and interpreted her narrative as legitimate advocacy for women's representation in sustainability fields. She wrote about facing mysterious professional obstacles when trying to collaborate with technical teams, described unnamed male colleagues who used corporate policies to maintain old boy networks, and positioned herself as a whistleblower exposing systemic discrimination that prevented women from participating equally in the clean energy revolution. The irony of someone who'd maintained secret communications with an ex-boyfriend while living with another man now claiming to be a victim of professional discrimination wasn't lost on me, but I recognized that responding publicly would only amplify her platform and potentially damage my own professional reputation. My company's legal team, concerned about potential defamation implications and negative publicity for our sustainable energy initiative, forced the removal of specific references to our project and corporate name through cease and desist communications, but not before several industry colleagues had screenshot and circulated the post privately among environmental professional networks. The incident taught me that Autumn's capacity for manipulating narratives extended far beyond personal relationships into professional contexts where she could weaponize social justice language to mask what was fundamentally stalking behavior, transforming her inability to accept rejection into a broader commentary about gender dynamics that allowed her to recruit unknowing allies in her campaign to force contact with someone who had clearly chosen to maintain distance. 4 weeks afterward, I received LinkedIn messages from environmental professionals who had read her post and wanted to discuss workplace discrimination in renewable energy, conversations that required careful navigation to avoid discussing personal details while addressing legitimate concerns about gender equity in our field that had nothing to do with Autumn's specific situation. The physical intimidation began 2 months after the blog post controversy died down, escalating from digital harassment into real-world stalking that forced me to fundamentally reconsider my personal security and living situation. Packages started appearing at my apartment complex's front office, always addressed to me with no return address but bearing postmarks from various Vermont post offices, containing items that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of our shared history and the specific places that had held meaning during our 8-month relationship. The first package contained pressed wildflowers from hiking trails we'd explored together in the Green Mountains, carefully preserved between sheets of archival paper with handwritten notes identifying each species and the specific location where we'd photographed them during weekend excursions that had once represented the best parts of our relationship before everything became complicated by secret phone calls and emotional deception. Each flower was labeled with scientific names and GPS coordinates, along with dates that corresponded to particularly happy memories from our early months together, as if she was trying to remind me of what we'd supposedly lost through my unwillingness to fight for our connection. The second delivery included a 3-page handwritten letter analyzing our communication breakdown with the clinical detachment of someone who had read extensively about relationship psychology, complete with highlighted passages from books about emotional avoidance and attachment theory that she'd obviously purchased specifically to diagnose what she perceived as my character flaws and relationship deficiencies that had supposedly driven her towards seeking emotional connection elsewhere. Subsequent packages contained copies of self-help books with sticky notes marking passages about men who fear commitment, articles about how childhood experiences influence adult intimacy patterns, and even a flash drive containing what appeared to be recorded conversations from our relationship that I had no memory of her documenting during ordinary moments that I'd assumed were private expressions of affection rather than evidence-gathering sessions for future psychological analysis. The pattern revealed someone who had spent considerable time and energy constructing a narrative where our relationship's failure was entirely attributable to my emotional limitations rather than her systematic deception and secret communications with her ex-boyfriend, as if psychological analysis could somehow retroactively justify her behavior or create an obligation for me to re-engage with someone who had violated basic trust through deliberate lies and hidden phone relationships that she'd maintained for months while sharing a living space and financial obligations with me. Even more disturbing was her research into my climbing schedule, which she'd apparently compiled through careful monitoring of social media posts from the outdoor recreation groups I'd joined in Albuquerque, cross-referencing my activity with local climbing forums and event announcements to predict when and where I'd be spending my weekend recreation time. I started noticing the same white Toyota Camry rental car appearing at trailheads where my climbing group met for weekend adventures, always parked at a distance but positioned with clear sightlines to the main parking area, occupied by what appeared to be a lone female figure wearing sunglasses who would start her engine and disappear whenever our group approached the area to unload gear and check route information. She began appearing at the same climbing locations we frequented, always maintaining plausible deniability about the coincidences, claiming to be exploring new areas or meeting other climbing groups that never seemed to materialize when questioned by members of our group who noticed the pattern and became concerned about someone apparently following us to remote outdoor locations. The harassment escalated to a breaking point when Sage and I planned a camping trip to Bandelier National Monument, a weekend getaway to explore ancient Puebloan cliff dwellings and enjoy some hiking away from the city, only to return Sunday evening around 9 p.m. and find Autumn sitting in my apartment complex's main lobby at nearly midnight like she'd been conducting surveillance on my coming and going patterns. She was positioned strategically near the mailboxes where she could monitor everyone entering or leaving the building, claiming she'd flown to Albuquerque for an emergency client meeting and just wanted to have an adult conversation about closure rather than continuing to wonder what had gone wrong between us without ever getting my perspective on the relationship's end. Her appearance was disheveled in a way that suggested she'd been waiting for hours, her clothes wrinkled and her hair uncombed, carrying a large canvas tote bag that probably contained more letters, books, or psychological analysis materials she'd prepared for whatever confrontation she'd been planning during what must have been an expensive cross-country flight undertaken solely to ambush someone who had clearly chosen to maintain no contact for over 8 months. I immediately called complex security and local police while Sage documented everything with her phone, creating a comprehensive record of Autumn's presence, her disheveled state, and the circumstances that had brought her across the country to wait in my apartment lobby like some kind of relationship detective seeking answers to questions that had already been definitively resolved through my departure from Vermont. When officers arrived, Autumn broke down emotionally, insisting she wasn't some crazy ex-girlfriend stereotype and only wanted to understand what had gone wrong between us, as if geographical distance and 8 months of silence hadn't already provided sufficient clarity about my desire to permanently end our relationship and move forward with someone who valued honesty over complicated emotional manipulation. The police issued a formal trespassing warning while Autumn alternated between tears and angry declarations that she deserved answers about why I'd abandoned our relationship without giving her a chance to explain her side of the complicated situation that had supposedly driven her toward maintaining secret communications with Trevor, as if emotional infidelity could be justified through relationship dissatisfaction that she'd never actually communicated during the months she was conducting her hidden phone relationship. The protective order was approved after I presented 8 months of meticulously documented harassment evidence to a family court judge who seemed genuinely disturbed by the systematic nature of Autumn's campaign and the geographical boundaries she'd crossed to maintain contact with someone who had clearly chosen to end their relationship. My presentation included phone records showing the secret second line, screenshots of her fake social media profiles and climbing forum posts, copies of the anonymous emails sent to Sage's workplace, photographs of the packages she'd mailed from Vermont containing pressed flowers and psychological analysis materials, security camera footage from my apartment complex showing her waiting in the lobby at midnight, and the police report from her trespassing incident that documented her emotional breakdown and claims about deserving closure from someone who owed her no explanation beyond the note I'd left 8 months earlier. The judge issued a comprehensive restraining order requiring Autumn to maintain at least 500 feet of distance from my residence, workplace, and any recreational facilities I was known to frequent, while prohibiting all forms of direct or indirect communication including social media contact, third-party messages, and the mailing of packages or letters regardless of their apparent innocent content. The legal victory felt hollow rather than triumphant because I recognized that someone willing to fly across the country to ambush their ex-boyfriend in his apartment lobby probably wouldn't be deterred by a piece of paper, even one backed by potential criminal charges if violated. Autumn proved my assessment correct by violating the protective order within 10 days, demonstrating either complete disregard for legal consequences or such profound psychological instability that she couldn't control her behavior even when faced with potential arrest and prosecution. She created a false identity using the name Jessica Martinez and joined my climbing gym in Albuquerque, apparently conducting enough research to discover which facility I used for indoor training during weekday evenings when outdoor climbing wasn't practical due to work schedules or weather conditions. Her disguise was surprisingly sophisticated, involving a dark wig that completely changed her appearance, colored contact lenses that transformed her blue eyes to brown, and what appeared to be professionally applied makeup that altered the structure of her facial features enough that I didn't immediately recognize her during a Tuesday evening bouldering session until she approached me directly and began asking questions about route recommendations in a voice pitched slightly lower than her normal speaking tone. The conversation felt oddly familiar before I realized who I was talking to, and when recognition finally hit, I experienced that same analytical calm that had carried me through discovering her secret phone relationship, understanding immediately that I needed to document everything while extracting myself from the situation without creating a scene that might escalate into something dangerous. I took photos of her gym membership card when she wasn't looking, recorded our brief conversation using my phone's voice memo function, and immediately contacted both gym management and local police to report the protective order violation that had required considerable planning and financial investment to execute. Her arrest occurred the following morning when police officers found her in the gym parking lot apparently conducting surveillance on my training schedule, sitting in another rental car with notebooks containing detailed information about my weekly routines and what appeared to be floor plans of my apartment complex that she'd somehow obtained through methods I preferred not to contemplate. The arrest led to court-mandated psychological evaluation and anger management program enrollment, legal consequences that finally provided external validation of what I'd been experiencing for months while also revealing the underlying mental health issues that had driven her to cross state lines multiple times in pursuit of someone who had clearly chosen to maintain no contact with her. During the legal proceedings, I learned that Autumn had been diagnosed with attachment disorder and obsessive tendencies related to abandonment trauma from her childhood, psychological conditions that explained but didn't excuse her systematic violation of boundaries and inability to accept rejection from someone who had discovered her deception and chosen to prioritize honesty in future relationships. The court-ordered therapy and anger management program kept her occupied in Vermont for the next 6 months while I finally experienced the peace and stability that should characterize normal adult life, allowing my relationship with Sage to develop naturally without the constant threat of harassment or professional interference from someone who couldn't accept that their own choices had ended our connection. 3 years passed without any contact or incident, during which Sage and I got married in a small ceremony at White Sands National Park with our families present, purchased an Adobe-style home in Albuquerque's foothills with mountain views that reminded me daily of how much my life had improved since leaving Vermont, and adopted 2 rescue cats named Luna and Soul who provided the kind of uncomplicated affection I'd forgotten was possible during the months of managing Autumn's emotional volatility and secretive behavior. My career flourished without the mental energy drain of constant relationship crisis management, leading to a promotion to senior project manager overseeing renewable energy installations across the entire southwestern region, work that felt meaningful and rewarding in ways that made me grateful for the painful experience that had ultimately guided me toward building a life based on transparency, mutual respect, and shared commitment to actually being present for each other rather than maintaining elaborate deceptions that required secret phone lines and hidden applications to sustain emotional relationships with multiple people simultaneously. 7 years later, I learned through our mutual friend Lisa that Autumn had relocated to Costa Rica, married a documentary filmmaker named Miguel who specialized in environmental conservation projects, and launched a retreat center focused on helping people heal from toxic relationship patterns and communication breakdowns that prevent authentic emotional connection. The irony of someone who had conducted secret phone relationships while living with another person now offering relationship counseling wasn't lost on me, but I found myself genuinely hoping she'd found the peace and self-awareness that had been missing during our time together in Vermont when her inability to communicate honestly about her needs had led to the systematic deception that destroyed our relationship and created months of psychological turmoil for both of us. Lisa mentioned that Autumn had spent years in intensive therapy working through the attachment issues and abandonment trauma that had driven her to violate boundaries and pursue contact with someone who had clearly chosen to end their relationship. Psychological work that apparently included taking responsibility for her behavior rather than continuing to blame external circumstances or other people's emotional limitations for choices she'd made independently while maintaining secret communications with her ex-boyfriend. 6 months after Lisa's update, I received a formal letter of apology through Autumn's therapist in Costa Rica, a carefully worded acknowledgement that accepted full responsibility for the harassment campaign, the professional interference, the stalking behavior, and the violation of legal boundaries that had characterized her response to our breakup. The letter expressed genuine wishes for my happiness without requesting any response or attempting to re-establish contact, recognizing that closure was something she needed to create internally rather than demanding from someone she had systematically harmed through months of psychological manipulation and boundary violations that had crossed multiple state lines and required legal intervention to stop. I read the letter once while sitting on my back patio with Sage, discussed its contents briefly to ensure my wife understood the situation and felt comfortable with my response, then made the decision to burn it in our backyard fire bowl during our weekly date night rather than keeping it as some kind of memento from a relationship that had taught me valuable lessons about recognizing deception and prioritizing honesty in future connections. Sitting on our patio that evening, watching the sunset paint the Sandia Mountains in brilliant shades of orange and purple while our 4-year-old twin daughters Sophia and Elena played in the garden we'd planted together using native plants that required minimal water and provided habitat for local wildlife, I reflected on how Autumn's deception and subsequent stalking campaign had actually guided me toward building the relationship I'd always wanted but hadn't known how to recognize or create, with someone who shared my values about transparency and commitment. Sage and I had created a partnership based on the kind of transparent communication and mutual respect that makes complicated situations unnecessary, where disagreements are addressed directly rather than hidden through secret phone calls and elaborate emotional manipulation that requires maintaining separate identities and communication channels to sustain relationships with multiple people simultaneously. We'd built a life where neither of us had to wonder about the other's commitment or question whether mysterious late-night conversations were threatening our shared future, where love is expressed through daily choices to prioritize our relationship rather than dramatic gestures designed to compensate for fundamental dishonesty about intentions and emotional availability toward the person we'd committed to building a life with. The solar panels on our roof provided clean energy for our home while serving as a daily reminder that sustainable systems require honest assessment of current conditions, strategic planning for long-term goals, and the discipline to maintain consistent performance rather than seeking quick fixes for underlying structural problems that compromise the entire system's integrity and reliability over time. Our daughters were learning to identify different types of desert plants in our xeriscaped backyard, asking questions about renewable energy and environmental conservation that reminded me how much my work had evolved from simply installing solar panels to educating the next generation about sustainable living practices that would shape their understanding of responsible resource management throughout their lives. I understood now that genuine love isn't about maintaining complicated secrets or winning someone back through persistence and emotional manipulation, but about finding someone who chooses transparency and commitment through both peaceful moments and unexpected challenges that test whether two people are genuinely compatible partners or merely attracted to the idea of being in a relationship regardless of actual emotional compatibility and shared values. The experience with Autumn had taught me to recognize the difference between someone who loves the security of having a boyfriend and someone who actually values the specific person they're sharing their life with, between someone who sees relationships as emotional safety nets and someone who approaches partnership as an opportunity to build something meaningful together rather than using another person to avoid facing their own psychological work and personal growth requirements. Watching Sage help our daughters identify the different types of cacti we'd planted along our walking path, I felt profound gratitude for the painful experience that had ultimately led me to someone who appreciated honesty over excitement, stability over drama, and authentic connection over the kind of complicated emotional dynamics that require therapy to decode and legal intervention to escape.